No, the QAnon conspiracy theory is not the new Satanic Panic, and let's keep it that way. I'll be talking about both of these phenomena, as well as reading some listener mail, including why hypocritical self-deceit still has no place in Satanism, especially ritual.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Occasionally I will see a Satanist claiming that we are in the midst of a new Satanic Panic. And perhaps more specifically, it's this phenomenon known as QAnon. I've even run into some people who claim that the Satanic Panic never really ended. And in short, I have to say these assessments are incorrect. And I will be presenting my arguments to support this position of mine in this episode of Satansplain. First of all, if we're going to talk about these topics, let's get some working definitions. What was the Satanic Panic? Let's start with that. I would say the Satanic Panic was, to sum it up, a hysteria that happened mostly during the 1980s, where people believed there were roving bands of devil worshippers all across the United States and elsewhere, doing all sorts of horrific things, like sacrificing animals, kidnapping and sacrificing human babies, and so on. Now, notice, though, that I described this as a hysteria, which is what the word panic refers to when we say Satanic Panic. That's the key word which it seems a lot of people miss when they try comparing this with QAnon. Now, I myself grew up in the 1980s in the United States. I was a teenager during what perhaps was the height of the Satanic Panic, and I remember it well. And not to belittle anybody listening who may be too young to have lived through that time, but it's hard to explain just how crazy it was if you didn't live through that time. And again, I will emphasize this again and again, the key word here is hysteria or panic. Because to be perfectly clear, all of these unfounded notions of Satanists being devil worshippers who drink goat's blood and sacrifice babies and conjure demons and blah, 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 those were all nothing new. You know, those stories have been around for centuries, really, even though there isn't much of any evidence for it. There have been frightening stories made up by Christians to scare people and keeping them in line, some of which, by the way, are just old, recycled anti-Semitic stories. So yeah, if you go back far enough in Christian propaganda, and you'll read some propaganda against Jewish people saying that the way they slaughter animals for kosher law has something to do with sacrifices to the devil and strange robes and strange languages and so on. I went into some of this in detail back in Satansplain episode number 26. But a quick side rant here. Of course, nowadays you run into anti-Semites who desperately want to link Satanism to Judaism. In fact, they're so anti-Semitic, they try to draw this connection in an effort to discredit Satanism. Think of how much of a bigot you have to be, where you're a Christian, and it's not enough that, Satanism, our religion, is explicitly named after whom they believe to be the Prince of Darkness and the enemy of their God. Like, that's not the bad part. The bad part is we may have some connection with the people who wrote the Old Testament. It's just so profoundly dumb. I had one of these idiots dare me on Twitter to say something bad about the Talmud. Some of you might remember that from last year. To try to prove to him that Satanism and Judaism are two completely different religions. So I went ahead, I read the Talmud, randomly flipped around and said, okay, the Talmud says this. This completely goes against Satanism, and here's the Satanic Bible page that backs up what I said. And I did that with like 10 examples. Again, beyond retarded people. But getting back to the point, the claims that Satanists do all these horrific things, or that there are agents of the devil who do these things. It certainly started well before the 1980s, and it didn't completely end after the 1980s. Of course, to add to the confusion, you will find the occasional lunatic who styles himself after these stories made up by Christians. But once again, and I can't stress this enough, the Satanic Panic was a panic, a hysteria. The Satanic Panic was not limited to evangelical Christians pushing all of these ridiculous stories and fears about Satanists and satanic ritual abuse, as it was called. No, the notion was also being propagated by the media. That's because the topic is a sensationalist topic to them. Sensationalism sells. And that was most especially being pushed on daytime talk shows in the 1980s, which were immensely popular at that time. Donahue, Oprah Winfrey, Montel Williams, The Joan Rivers Show, Geraldo, Morton Downey Jr., and all these other ones. These shows where, you would have a special on satanic ritual abuse. Are your children in danger from Satanists? And on these shows, if we were lucky, you would see one or more representatives from the Church of Satan talking to these people on the air, explaining, no, Montel, Satanists do not do these things you're describing. That's not what our religion is all about. It's either stuff made up by Christians or people styling themselves after that, and crazy people doing things, and the media trying to claim it was a Satanist. But, then of course for every 10 seconds, somebody from the Church of Satan got to speak. There would be some supposed occult expert claiming how real these crimes were with, one anecdote after the next. And maybe they would also bring on a guest who claimed to have been a victim of a satanic cult. She had been abducted by a satanic cult and they did this and this to her. And the audience just buys up her sob story with no critical thinking applied. Nobody dares to notice that the details of her story don't really add up. And then the camera turns to us and say, okay, Church of Satan, you have 10 seconds to respond to this before we go to commercial break. So you get the idea. I mean, it was insane. And it certainly wasn't due to a lack of effort from the Church of Satan in combating this misinformation. We told the truth and put it out there, but, people are just sheep. And again, it wasn't just the evangelical Christians, and for that matter, not even the daytime talk shows doing this sort of stuff. Though, needless to say, the evangelical Christians were pushing this a lot. Televangelists were immensely popular in the 1980s, too. Christians stopped going to church a lot of times and just listened to Jimmy Swaggart or the 700 Club or other shows like that, sending their donation money. And needless to say, pushing the satanic angle was a big thing on those shows, too. But you also had these so-called occult experts working with law enforcement, and the police a lot of times would buy into this propaganda. Well, we searched the attic of the killer's home, and we found a solid colored bathrobe. And in a kitchen drawer, we found some birthday candles. So, yeah, clearly he was performing occult rituals. Teachers as well. The parents would then buy into these fears too, even if they weren't really devout Christians themselves or Christians at all. And this is where we get into the real hysteria part of it. Because you have this situation where people's imagination went wild, and suddenly anything could be perceived as a possible gateway into devil worship, or signs that a devil worshiper had been there. So one of these occult experts would point to graffiti under a bridge that kind of sort of looked like a 5-pointed star or a skull or whatever, and say, clearly this was the meeting place of a satanic ritual. If you listened to heavy metal, forget it. There were at least some kids at school even who would suspect you of being a devil worshiper if you wore a Metallica shirt too many times. Police had an excuse to harass you. And likewise, heavy metal bands would get pulled into these talk shows or the media and have to defend themselves, trying to explain that no, they're not really devil worshippers. They just like using these scary images as a gimmick, sign of rebellion. Ozzy Osbourne had to keep explaining he was not a devil worshiper so many times. But it went beyond things like heavy metal or horror movies. Anything strange or exotic was viewed with suspicion and possibly satanic, especially if young people did it. So Dungeons and Dragons was a famous example. There was a claim that playing Dungeons and Dragons could lead to not only devil worship, but also suicide. And the evidence for this was, if I recall, like one teenager who committed suicide, and it was believed that this teen played D&D. So, that explains it. But thankfully, there were some more skeptical people who pointed out that D&D had sold millions and millions of units. So, given the disproportionate number of teenagers who buy D&D, and the disproportionate number of teens who commit suicide compared to other age groups, it seemed statistically inevitable that somewhere these two demographics would overlap. Statistically, it seems inevitable that, there would be a teen who would both have Dungeons and Dragons and commit suicide. It doesn't mean one is the cause of the other. But interestingly enough, further examination revealed that if you did the math and factor in the number of suicide victims who did and did not play Dungeons and Dragons, it turned out that D&D players were statistically less likely to commit suicide. Apparently, people who get together with friends they trust to do fun things together tend to have less desperation in their lives. Go figure. Likewise, any strange symbol that people didn't know about was automatically suspected of being a satanic symbol. There was an evangelist at that time named Bob Larson, and he had a book called Satanism, the Seduction of America's Youth. And I think he had a couple of other books on this too. But, another Christian evangelist with a radio show trying to push this fear at the time, the Satanic Panic. But I mentioned symbols, and in this book, he had a page of satanic symbols, which included not only the pentagram, but things like the Egyptian Ankh, and like the Blue Oyster Cult symbol, and even the peace sign. And I had a friend at the time, Jeremy. I remember this was in the late 1980s. He had a symbol he drew on his skateboard, and some nervous kid asked him if it was a satanic symbol. And Jeremy had to explain, no, that's the symbol for the pop band, The Outfield. It was like a triangle with a curved line to represent a baseball diamond. Anyway, so as for where this whole satanic panic started, people these days typically consider the start of it to be a book called Michelle Remembers. It was published in 1980, and it was a book written by a psychiatrist named Lawrence Pazder, and it was co-written by the patient, Michelle Smith, whom Pazder eventually married. So Pazder claimed that Michelle had been the victim of a satanic cult, but the experiences were so horrific that she blotted them out of her memory. But thanks to something called recovered memory therapy, Pazder was able to put Michelle in a state of hypnosis and uncover these memories she had blocked, extract them through hypnosis. And this process of recovered memory therapy ended up being used on other people, including, not only alleged victims of satanic ritual, but also people supposedly abducted by aliens. In short, though, it later turned out that this whole process was bunk. It turns out that this was a phenomenon known as false memory syndrome, which is where you put somebody in a state of hypnosis, which puts them in a very subjective state, and the therapist effectively plants false memories in the patient's brain by suggestion. So, for example, the patient is under hypnosis. The therapist says, and then you went into the house. Patient's like, yeah, I went into the house. And how many people were inside? I don't know. Were there 4 people? Yeah, there were 4 people. Was there a book on the ground? Yeah, I see it, doctor. I see a book on the ground. Was the book titled The Satan Bible of Lies by Anton Crowley? Yeah, that's it. The Satan Bible of Lies by Anton Crowley. So the patient hears the suggestion, which means they have to think about it and visualize that in their mind. And in this suggestive state, the line between imagination and memory gets blurred. Because it turns out that the human memory is not exactly like a video that's recorded and played back, but ideas that didn't happen can be programmed in there. In any case, that book Michelle remembers is what seemed to get the whole hysteria going. In the decade that followed, there were countless accusations, unfounded accusations against people. Occasionally some crazy person like Richard Ramirez would show up, an actual deranged psycho killer who channeled his crimes into a devilish aesthetic, and the occult experts point to unrelated incidents like him and say, see, it exists, it's a real problem, it's really Satanism, and that's what real Satanists do. And once again, we would have to say, no, that's not what Satanism is at all. This guy isn't practicing anything we do or have written about. Why don't you read the Satanic Bible? But the occult experts and journalists and media then try rationalizing this. Well, you Satanists aren't the types of Satanists we're talking about, obviously. We're going to call you guys LaVeyan Satanists, and we're going to call the devil worshippers theistic Satanists or traditional Satanists, even though there is no established tradition, and even though this sounds like you two are different denominations of the same religion, even though you're not. You see, folks, this is why I never ever use the term LaVeyan Satanist to describe myself, and neither should you. The term does not clear up any confusion, it only adds to it. And it was invented by people who wanted to justify using the label of Satanist on people of a completely different set of beliefs and behaviors. LaVeyan Satanist is a redundant term. People who adhere to the religion formulated by Anton Szandor LaVey are called Satanists. Richard Ramirez was a devil-worshipping freak. So, I mentioned when the Satanic Panic started. As for when the Satanic Panic ended, I personally think it ended around the time of the Gulf War, because America, by then, had a new enemy, and the media had a new fear they could report on. Then again, the West Memphis 3, which you can read about online as well as in the Satanic Scriptures, that thing happened in 1994. I would argue that this was an exception, though. Another event to consider is the Judas Priest trial, the Judas Priest trials of 1990, where the band Judas Priest was accused of putting subliminal messages into their albums, another one of these weird lies that Christians like to propagate. And the fans supposedly heard these backwards messages or hidden messages, subliminal messages, and that was the reason for the suicide. So anyway, long story short, it was ridiculous and found to be bunk, big waste of everybody's time. But I bring it up because I think the Judas Priest trials were an example where, by that point, the public was starting to go, okay, wait a minute, this whole satanic thing is starting to get stupid. So in any case, the Satanic Panic was a hysteria that roughly started in 1980 and was gone by sometime in the 1990s. And I keep running into some Satanists who try to argue that the Satanic Panic never ended, and they point to evangelical Christians of today as evidence of this, but this is completely wrong. Again, the Satanic Panic hysteria was a hysteria, which precisely means it was not just the holy rollers who were pushing this stuff. It was everybody. And the average citizen even bought into the idea that these things were happening. And that is no longer the case today. Which brings me to QAnon. So I explained the Satanic Panic. Let's get into QAnon. What the hell is QAnon? Well, QAnon is a conspiracy theory that started in 2017, but it seems to have its roots in a conspiracy theory from the previous year, a conspiracy theory called Pizzagate. Okay, so what the hell is Pizzagate? Well, back in 2016, thousands of emails from presidential nominee Hillary Clinton got hacked and leaked to the internet. People then claimed that within these emails you could find little code words and hints that Clinton and other politicians were involved in a child trafficking ring for a satanic cult. And one of the meeting places for this was some pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. So that's where the name Pizzagate comes from, a combination of the words pizza and Watergate. Watergate being the scandal that happened under President Nixon. And now, of course, that I mention it, I'll probably get flagged on YouTube. YouTube is going to see that I use the word pizza followed by the word gate and probably flag me. Oh well. Anyway, some people realized that the details of these accusations didn't really hold up. So fast forward to 2017, an account under the name Q shows up on 4chan and then later 8chan, claiming to be somebody working deep in the government with top secret clearance, with access to classified information about President Trump and the people who are trying to take him down. And a lot of popular social media sites would flag and remove QAnon stories, which in my opinion was a stupid reaction to do because, of course, when you have conspiracy theorists who believe they have a story that the government is trying to hide and you censor them, the conspiracy theorists are going to go, see, it must be true, because why else would they silence me if it was just a myth? Anyway, some of you might remember that time on Twitter several years back, early in the month of January one year, where one of these QAnon believers decided to tag Chelsea Clinton, it was the daughter of Bill and Hillary Clinton, as well as tag the Church of Satan, and also tag one of Chelsea's friends, and tag Hooters, the restaurant, for some reason. Why do they do this? Well, because they're crazy and they have no life, and hope that if they tag enough random people together, they will get them attention. And in this particular case, Chelsea Clinton's friend saw this stupid thread and replied back, what the hell is this about? Like, why is this person tagging me? And if I recall correctly, Chelsea said, I don't know, some lunatic is just tagging all of us together. And then somebody from the Church of Satan account replies back something along the lines of, yeah, people are stupid. Anyway, Happy New Year. And Chelsea says something in reply like, yeah, LOL, Happy New Year. And of course, the conspiracy theorists run wild with this, and they still bring it up to this day. Oh, look, this proves the Clintons are involved in satanic cults, and Chelsea Clinton is a member of the Church of Satan, is a Satanist, and so are all the Clintons. No, it doesn't prove that. All it proves is that you're such an idiot in trying to link the Clintons to Satanists, that both the Clintons and the Satanists are laughing at you for being an idiot. Now, on to the big question. Is any of this QAnon stuff comparable to the Satanic Panic? Well, in both cases, you do have a group of crazy people who believe there are satanic cults with the same old stories about child sacrifice, but I would say that's where the similarity ends. Remember, I kept stressing earlier that the Satanic Panic was a panic, a hysteria. That it was not just the Jesus freaks who believed it and propagated it. It was the media, it was the daytime talk shows, it was the law enforcement, it was school administrations, it was the entertainment industry with scary movies about people doing these things. Now, QAnon, on the other hand, is not a belief that's widely popular enough to be considered Satanic Panic 2.0. QAnon believers are rightfully dismissed by the average person as nutty conspiracy theorists. They even get banned on social media. Even most conservatives roll their eyes at the QAnon believers and rightfully call them nuts. I don't see the Daily Wire, for example, supporting QAnon, let alone see it from ex-President Trump on Truth Social. In fact, if any of you more right-wing people out there may be listening, let me say this. I may be a Satanist, but I am against pedophilia. I am against serial killers. I am against corruption in high levels of the government. I am against globalism. And yes, these sorts of crimes should be investigated and exposed. But when you needlessly accuse public figures you don't like of being in some sort of satanic cabal then people will immediately stop taking you seriously. You make the average person less inclined to investigate anything about human trafficking or bureaucracy or whatever. And of course, when I try explaining this to them, I just get, well, you're a Satanist, so whatever you say is a lie, and I'm not going to listen to you. Go figure. So no, QAnon is not Satanic Panic 2.0. It is still, as of now, rightfully dismissed as a fringe conspiracy theory, not a panic that non-extremists buy into. If the QAnon thing were truly a new satanic panic, things would be very different. If QAnon were the new satanic panic, we would turn on television shows like The View and see them interviewing spirit cooking survivors. They'd be crying to Whoopi Goldberg, telling their woesome tale about surviving a satanic cult, and please buy their book. If QAnon were a new satanic panic, you would see policemen on a murder scene saying, well, we found a bumper sticker in the attic of the killer's home, and it said, vote for Democrat John Kerry in 2004. So this could explain where he got the idea to kill and rape the boy next door. Now, if we were in a new satanic panic, teachers in schools would be saying, well, I'm suspicious of Johnny because he keeps ordering pizza for lunch, which implies a connection to Pizzagate. And I heard he has an uncle that lives in Hollywood where all that sex trafficking takes place. No, you get my point, I should hope, by now. Now, if anything, I see more of a panic going on with the far left ideologists than the far right. I know what I just said is going to piss off some listeners out there, but hear me out. Let's think about this. Look at all the people who believe the biggest problem in the world is racism, namely racism from white people. That there are roving bands of white supremacists in any town doing whatever crimes. Remember I said how back during the Satanic Panic people saw a symbol they didn't understand and suspected it was a satanic symbol? Well, paranoid people now do that with racism. Look at the 4chan prank that people fell for and continue to fall for, where pranksters made people believe that the OK hand gesture was a symbol for white power. That was a prank made to prove a point, which it did. There were young people in the 1980s who didn't know anything about Satanism, but they saw that wearing a pentagram got a rise out of stuffy authoritarian figures. Well, young people who aren't actually white supremacists do that today with politically incorrect memes. It's rebellious. Rebellion for rebellion's sake. Also, people do get falsely accused of racism and racist crimes based on a witch hunt where anybody can be accused of a microaggression in the workplace or what have you. Again, I'm sure there are some politically left-leaning Satanists out there who will think I'm crazy for even making any of these comparisons. You don't have to agree with everything I say on the show. But let me ask you this. If you really do believe that it's Republicans and people on the far right who are ushering in a satanic panic, why am I still safer walking through the city wearing a pentagram in public than I would be wearing a Make America Great Again cap? Okay, Bill's political rant over. All of that aside, is it still possible that a new satanic panic could happen, where the populace at large buys into the idea of roving bands of devil worshippers doing all these crimes at any given hour, and that anybody remotely connected to Satanism is thus connected to these crimes? I would say yes, it is a possibility that a panic like that could happen. If it happened before, it can happen again. Yes, it's possible that beliefs like QAnon or some similar crazy thing accusing Satanists of doing this and that and being here and there could become popular enough where we Satanists might have to be more cautious and be more in the closet for our own well-being. There is nothing gloriously satanic about being a martyr for Satanism. Self-preservation is the highest cause. And if Satanists and the Church of Satan can survive what happened in the 1980s, then I say we can survive it again. We've always been a bit underground. We can go more underground if needs be. That's an advantage of a cabal system versus a community. In the meantime, we do know that there are indeed some crazy fanatical Christians out there who believe, quote-unquote, Satanists are conjuring demons and want to destroy Christianity get babies for sacrifice, go after their children of these Christians, to kidnap them or indoctrinate them or sexualize them. There are people who sincerely believe this is a national and global threat, competing to get human souls or whatever. These people are religious zealots, and you cannot reason or compromise with a fanatic, most especially if they see you as their sworn enemy. They believe all these crimes they describe are real and that the people doing them are Satanists, and they believe absolutely that Satan is a real being. So if they find you are connected to Satan in any way, let alone an explicit way, then as far as they're concerned, you are complicit in those crimes in some way, and you are a threat to humanity that must be silenced, converted, or eliminated. Now, once again, thankfully, these people are not a majority, nor is the fanaticism popular or mobilized enough to be a real noticeable threat. I can still be a Satanist. I live in a very small conservative town, and I don't fear religious persecution. So I don't see it as a threat, and let's keep it that way. And if you want to keep it that way too, and avoid a new satanic panic, then you should realize that the absolute stupidest thing you could do is confirm the paranoia of these fanatics. Namely, confirm their fears of a satanic infiltration, and doing that by taunting, harassing, and most importantly, competing with these Christians in public life in the name of Satanism. If you do believe that a genuine Satanic Panic 2.0 is on the horizon, then the last thing you want to do is parade Satanism in front of them as some sort of human rights cause. What worked in the past for past social causes like black liberation or gay liberation most certainly does not apply to Satanism, and most especially against the sorts of people who would propagate a new satanic panic. You'll notice that it's certainly not what Satanists did during the Satanic Panic the first time around. What Satanists did in the 1980s is we got out there in the media to correct misinformation, and people like myself heard that and realized the Church of Satan was the real deal. Maybe a lot of other people weren't convinced, but that's really the best you can do. We did not act like oppressed victims or demand social acceptance. That's ludicrous. First of all, it's antithetical to Satanism. As I said in the previous episode of Satansplain, we are not a community in that collectivist social cause sense of the word community. We are Satanists. We are a cabal. We didn't name ourselves after mythology's most notorious adversarial character just to turn around and demand victim status from the same herd we set ourselves apart from. We didn't reject spiritual religions only to go back and mimic what we didn't like about them, like trying to insert religion into the government or sponsor 12-step programs or philanthropy for the sake of virtue signaling or martyrdom. But secondly, and more importantly, the reason why Satanists weren't trying to play the victim and try to play it off as a human rights cause in the 1980s, and the reason why that wouldn't work now either. Christian theocrats do not believe in religious plurality. If they did, they wouldn't be theocrats. No Christian, fanatic or otherwise, has ever said, well, I wanted to do this Christian thing in public, but if that means equal time for these people who showed up and said they're Satanists, gee, I'm going to have to back off. No, Christians do the exact opposite. They see Satanists, or at least people dressed up claiming to be Satanists, and they see it as a confirmation of their paranoia. And they double down. They double down in their evangelism. If a second satanic panic ever comes, it will not be the fault of QAnon conspiracy theorists, really, whom otherwise could continue yelling into the void. No, it will be the fault of filmmaker Kevin Solling and his personal prank group known as the Satanic Temple. Recently in Florida, Governor DeSantis called for religious chaplains to be allowed in public schools and explicitly said no Satanists. You can thank Kevin Solling for that. Thank him and his short-sighted supporters whose only goal is a short-term cheap thrill of upsetting Christians. And now that they've been needlessly poking that bear, we'll see where things go. Let's take a break. You are listening to Satansplain.
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com.
Do satanic cults lurk in the shadows? Can memories of satanic ritual abuse be repressed? Do exorcisms really drive out demons? And are those demons always possessing Zach Baggins? I'm JD Sword, the Satanic Skeptic. Join me on The Devil in the Details as I examine these questions and more, bringing a skeptical and satanic perspective to the paranormal. The Devil in the Details, available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, and more.
Handmade, all-natural, botanical perfumes, soaps, and ceremonial incense, sculptures and jewelry to adorn yourself and your other altars. All this and more await you at moonandsunemporium.com. Ritual perfumes and other occult fine art luxuries, created and curated by me, Priestess Sarah Josephine Clark, with tarot readings by Reverend Dr. Dylan Clark. moonandsunemporium.com.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Visit the official website for the show, satansplain.com. You can find episodes of Satansplain there, as well as a number of other places. You can find Satansplain on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and so on. Please give a like and a follow to Satansplain on social media. We have channels on X, Facebook, and YouTube. For all questions and correspondence, send an email to me directly, bill@satansplain.com. That is the email address. Satansplain also has a page on locals.com. Sign up for free on locals.com and join the satansplain.locals.com page. If you would like to show your support for the show, you can become a paid supporter on Locals for $5 a month. You can also visit the merch store, Satansplain t-shirts, coffee mugs, and more. Go to store.satansplain.com. I've got a couple of listener emails I would like to read. Carl wrote in with a satanic anecdote, or as we call them here on Satansplain, Satanecdotes, which means it's time for this episode's featured Satanecdote. Cue the Satanecdote theme song.
Satanic Anecdotes. Satanecdotes.
I get the impression from Carl's email that English is not his first language, so rather than read it to you word for word, I'm just going to try to reword this anecdote of his just for clarity. Back in the summer of 2023, I started collecting Funko Pop figures, so I'm sure you've seen these figures. I have a couple of myself. They're these little statues that look kind of like bobblehead dolls. They have them for different pop culture characters or famous people. Anyway, Carl continues. I ordered one of these figures through Amazon. It arrived at my mother's place. My mother then shows up where I work to bring it to me. We also meet up with my father, who works at the same place. I take the package, open it, and pull out the box, which has my Funko Pop figure, the Witch King from Lord of the Rings. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I had to look this one up myself. This little statue is this figure in a suit of like dark, ominous armor and a flaming sword. Pretty cool. So now that same day, Carl explains he was wearing his inverted cross necklace and t-shirt with a little inverted pentagram. Then the mother, waving her hand at Carl and the statue, asks, "Well, what does this mean altogether?" Carl explains, well, the necklace symbolizes the rejection of Christianity, and the pentagram symbolizes Satanism. Yeah, but what is the statue? Well, I like it because it's a favorite movie character of mine. Carl finishes by saying our conversation then ended. She rolled her eyes and shook her head, and my father made a face expressing dislike. Well, that concludes the Satanecdote from Carl, and I must say I have some questions after reading that. Like, would your parents have preferred it if they were told the statue does have some sort of satanic meaning, like it's a satanic altar prop. It just seems funny that they were disappointed that it was just some pop culture thing, unrelated. Actually, they were probably really embarrassed. Also, if you work in a place where they don't care if you wear satanic jewelry and your father works there too without any issue, then to me, getting wary about a Lord of the Rings statue is just even funnier. Oh, and by the way, to anybody listening who may be complaining about the inverted cross and saying, it's not a real satanic symbol, well, I suggest you listen to Satansplain episode number 57. Because yes, it's okay for Satanists to wear an inverted cross or use the number 666. Go and listen to episode 57 to hear why. And of course, if you have your own satanic anecdote to send, you can email it directly to me. bill@satansplain.com is the email address. Sometime a while back, I did a pair of Satansplain episodes about satanic ritual. It wasn't a planned special per se. It wasn't supposed to be the full explanation of any and all questions and answers for satanic ritual. But you see, I had gotten several questions on the topic from different listeners, and I thought it would be best to answer them all together and address a lot of the related questions and misconceptions of the topic along the way. So some of you listen to Satansplain on YouTube, and in the case of YouTube, I updated the comments on those shows recently with chapter breaks. So you can just click on a link and skip around to different parts. I try doing that with every episode, but sometimes I forget to. In any case, YouTube has been giving me some problems lately. I have no problem getting Satansplain episodes to all the other places. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and so on. But YouTube always gives me issues, and in fact, the previous episode of Satansplain didn't even upload at all. I had to go into YouTube and upload it manually, kind of a pain in the ass. But, this is why I make a point in mentioning in every single Satansplain episode that there is more than one way to listen to the show. I don't put all of my eggs in one basket. If all else fails for you, then there is always the official website, Satansplain.com. You can listen to episodes there. And with that out of the way, I want to get to this final email. I actually received this a couple of months ago and emailed my thoughts back, but it was one of those emails I never got around to including in the show. Shalina writes, my fiancé and I are having a bit of a disagreement, and while I loathe to bring a third party in, I feel at this point it is necessary. You see, I shared something personal with my fiancé about how I occasionally pray to God as my satanic ritual. Yeah, okay, you heard that right. Let's continue with the email. In the moments I am praying, I am suspending my disbelief, and when I'm done, I go right back to normal, which is someone who doesn't believe God exists. This provides relief occasionally. I am essentially burdening the air with my problems. Now, this calls into question two problems my fiancé points out. Number one is hypocritical self-deceit, and number two is that I can't deny magic worked for me after a ritual, or I will lose all I obtained. Now, Shalina here is referring to Satanic Rule of the Earth number 7, which I covered a couple episodes ago on Satansplain, on the episode about the rules of the earth. So by choosing to pray to a God that I quote-unquote believe in for a matter of 15 minutes to an hour, feeling relief, and then turning around and denying that prayer had any merit is also wrong. With all that said, I do believe my prayer has merit. It's simply personal merit. It relieves stress and anxiety, and I believe I achieve a better mental state afterward. It's cathartic and nostalgic for me to pray, as I grew up in a Lutheran household. Now, Anton LaVeyan may not have had my idea of a satanic ritual, but I believe it's still a good ritual. I will concede that I may be committing hypocritical self-deceit, but for a ritual, I think that is fine. We come to you to help shed some light on this issue. Ever since I told my fiancé about my ritual, he has called me a closet Christian, and while we both find it a little funny, I do worry that I am being what he calls a bad Satanist. And she adds that her and her fiance are both Satanists. Okay, so that is the email. And in response to this, well, it's hard to know where to begin. Because let's do a quick recap on the fundamentals of satanic ritual and the parts of satanic literature relating to the two other questions she asks, one about self-deceit and the other about acknowledging the power of magic. What I am going to say next is, I know, already common knowledge to a lot of Satanists, especially if you regularly listen to this show, but I think it bears repeating in this case. Satanism is a non-theistic religion. We are atheists, which means we do not believe in deities. It's true that the God of Satanism is oneself. I am my own God. If you are a Satanist, you are your own God. And in that sense, I believe in God. But obviously, in that context, I don't literally mean I believe myself to be a deity in the general supernatural sense of that word. No, when I say I am my own God, it's a metaphor. It means I am the one I serve. I am the one who is ultimately most important in my life. I am the one who bears the most responsibility of what goes on in my life, whether pleasurable or painful. But again, if we put that kind of symbolism aside and talk about literal deities, supernatural gods and goddesses like the kind you read about in mythology and other religions, no, we Satanists do not believe gods exist. They are fictional characters invented by humans. As we say in the Satanic Bible, man has always created gods rather than gods having created man. Satanism, however, is still a religion. Religions can be non-theistic. Satanism is not the only religion without gods or goddesses. There is Jainism, there's Theravada Buddhism, there's Taoism, Raelianism, and so on. Those are all examples of religions that do not have a god that they worship, well, that have a god at all, and likewise Satanism is not merely a philosophy, it is indeed a religion. Because besides having philosophy, it additionally has dogma, symbolism, and ceremony. And this brings us to satanic ritual. When we are in the ritual chamber and calling forth names like Satan, Lucifer, and the infernal names and so on, we know in the back of our minds that these characters are the fictional creation of humans. So these utterances are not done in a supernatural believing way. It is psychodrama. It is theater. Actually, I would argue that all religious ritual is ultimately just emotional theater, with no actual deity listening in. It's just that Satanism is the only religion who admits this. The reasons for satanic ritual are something I covered in depth in one of those two Satansplain episodes number 48 and 49, the ones about satanic ritual. But briefly to recap, as we say in the Satanic Bible, there is a human need for ceremony and symbolism, fantasy and enchantment. We accept the psychological power of symbolism, and especially personifications. So as a Satanist, when you enter the ritual chamber, you willingly suspend disbelief in that controlled environment. You objectively enter the subjective state of mind. You do your flair, your theatrics, your candle burning, your emotionalizing, and when you're finished, the theater is over. The fantasy session is over, and you can resume your normal, rational, skeptical day-to-day behavior. And just to quickly answer one question Chelina had, we do have self-deceit as one of the 9 satanic sins, and we also mention self-deceit in the 9 satanic statements. But this act of ritual is not really self-deceit. We describe the self-deceit in the 9 satanic sins list as follows. Quote, self-deceit. It's in the 9 satanic statements, but deserves to be repeated here. Another cardinal sin. We must not pay homage to any of the sacred cows presented to us, including the roles we are expected to play ourselves. The only time self-deceit should be entered into is when it's fun and with awareness. But then, it's not self-deceit. So again, when you go into the ritual chamber, you are doing it all with fun and with awareness, in which case it is not really self-deceit. As for what would be an example of self-deceit, I'm sure you can think of examples. If you're somebody who drinks a gallon of vodka a day and you lose your job due to drunkenness, you lost your driver's license due to multiple DUIs, but you tell yourself, no, I don't have a drinking problem, well, you're practicing self-deceit. So again, the act of satanic ritual in and of itself is not self-deceit in the satanic sense. However, I do see a lot of hypocritical self-deceit in Chalena's choice of ritual. So she described what she does. She goes into a ritual chamber and she prays to the Christian God. Now, it may be all just theatrical in her mind, but that's what she's doing. And it seems to me that her justification for this is basically, hey, we agree that all gods are fictional, including Satan. We knowingly suspend disbelief when we're conducting a ritual so that we can get into a full theatrical mindset, release our emotions, and it feels cathartic now without whatever emotion was bothering us. So therefore, isn't it equally permissible to believe in God during my ritual and pretend to submit to him and pray to him? I mean, I feel better, so the ends justify the means, right? And my answer to this is a flat-out no. No, this is not satanic ritual, and I don't buy this rationalized excuse for it. But I have met some angry people who would say that this stance of mine is wrong and that I'm gatekeeping. That's the word they love to use, gatekeeping. How dare you say that this fellow Satanist ritual is invalid, or that there's possibly anything wrong with it? How dare you? You're so close-minded, Bill. A ritual can be anything a Satanist wants it to be. Yes, there are people out there who would argue that I'm gatekeeping Satanism, that I'm being a close-minded religious fundamentalist, because I take the firm stance that praying to God, whether theatrical or sincere, has no place in a satanic ritual. I know these people exist because I have argued with them on Twitter before. I literally had somebody say that to me. I asked, okay, if Satanism can be anything you want it to be, can a Satanist pray to Jesus and still be a Satanist? And they actually tried rationalizing it. Well, yes, because that's valued to them. And to these people I say, are you fucking kidding me? As the cliche goes, don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. Now, I said earlier that one of the reasons for satanic ritual is this catharsis, this emotional release you get from ceremonial psychodrama. But that is not the only reason why we have rituals in Satanism. What is also pointed out in the Satanic Bible is that the various spiritual religions of the world make use of ritual in order to sustain their believers' beliefs in whatever supernatural stuff and rules you find in that religion. In fact, even outside of religion, humans use symbols and ceremony to sustain beliefs and commitments to things, whether it's loyalty to a company, a feeling of patriotism, a political cause, or whatever. Wearing a wedding ring, for example, does that. This is just something humans seem to naturally do anyway, with symbolism. So we can likewise use symbols and ceremony to sustain belief in satanic doctrine and satanic identity, rather than the lies of spiritual religions. So satanic ritual is not separate from satanic philosophy. They integrate together. As part of our philosophy, we recognize the human need for ceremony and ritual, fantasy and enchantment. We recognize that as great as atheism and science and critical thinking are, sometimes it takes an emotional drive to get things done and also make things interesting, make life interesting. And we can use ritual to strengthen our convictions in the philosophy as we deal with a world where we're constantly bombarded by anti-satanic sentiments. But to do this, it wouldn't make any sense to do things which contradict the philosophy, even if it's all theatrical or symbolic. LaVeyan points out in the Satanic Bible that there are a lot of occultists who don't seem to have their act together and do things ritualistically which seem like a conflict of interest. They don't really match up with their convictions. And this is where we get to hypocritical self-deceit. From the Satanic Bible, read you an excerpt. In a satanic magical ceremony, the participants do not join hands and dance ring around the rosy in a circle, burn candles of various colors for various wishes, call out the names of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, while supposedly practicing the black arts, pick a saint for their personal guide for obtaining help for their problems, dunk themselves in smelly oils and hope the money comes in, meditate so they can arrive at a great spiritual awakening, recite long incantations with the name of Jesus thrown in for good measure, between every few words, etc., 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 ad nauseum, because this is not the way to practice satanic magic. If you cannot divorce yourself from hypocritical self-deceit, you will never be a successful magician, much less a Satanist. The satanic religion has not merely lifted the coin, it has flipped it completely over. Therefore, why should it support the very principles to which it is completely opposed by calling itself anything other than a name which is totally in keeping with reversed doctrines which make up the satanic philosophy? Satanism is not a white light religion. It is a religion of the flesh, the mundane, the carnal, all of which are ruled by Satan, the personification of the left-hand path. So in my reply to Shalina, I said, as for your approach here of praying to God as a satanic ritual, sorry, but this doesn't really make any sense to me. Yes, I understand that you are doing this just in a controlled session, in a pretend way, but even as something theatrical and cathartic, it doesn't make any sense to me within the context of Satanism. Anton LaVeyan describes some of the fundamental differences between prayer and greater magic in the introduction of the satanic rituals. Recall his analogy with applying for a loan versus writing a check. If you carefully read things like the invocation to Satan or other ritual lines of Satanism, you'll notice that even within this context of suspended disbelief with these fictional characters, the process is not prayer. These rituals are not forms of apprehensive begging and servitude to an overlord. The invocation does not say, please, Satan. It says, I command. It doesn't say, thy will be done. It says, do this by manifesting my desires. So, Shalina, I'm rather puzzled by why you use the approach that you use as opposed to, say, just doing the standard 13-step ritual from the Satanic Bible, but with a set of requests for yourself spoken in the middle, or perhaps a conjuration of compassion where the target is yourself. It seems you find something satisfying about this servitude approach. Maybe another option is to try using an image of yourself so that the God you are praying to is the true God of the Satanist, oneself. Again, I would argue that servitude like that has no place in a satanic ritual, but at least with yourself in there, it would seem more philosophically consistent than what you're doing now, which is calling yourself a Satanist and then submitting to the personification of Satan's enemy from mythology. Let's get back to the two questions from Shalina's email. Is this self-deceit? And would trying to connect things now be going against the satanic rule of the earth, number 7? Well, as I already said, the act of ritual in and of itself is not self-deceit. However, I am afraid to say that this specific practice of praying to God in a ritual chamber when you're a Satanist is indeed hypocritical self-deceit, for the reasons I gave. No amount of rationalizing is really going to make it something else. As for satanic rule of the earth, number 7, like I said, this is something I talked about in detail in Satansplain episode number 60. In short, I say rule number 7 is a warning against self-sabotage. If you utilize ritual in shaping your mind and your outcome, and you obtain what you want, but then later try to rationalize what happened and downplay the role of ritual as it had in that, then that can fester in the self-doubt, which can then put you on a reverse path to losing what you obtained. There's nothing, supernatural or cosmic about this. It's right up there with the attitude of getting something great and thinking, well, gee, I don't know if I deserve this. I see people who do that. If you keep having that view, then yeah, you're probably going to lose whatever good thing it is. Now, applying this back to the situation at hand in this email, she asks if denying her prayer had any merit would likewise cause this sort of self-sabotage. It seems to me, though, that the question is, should you double down in your hypocritical self-deceit or call it into question? I would say call it into question. Because at this point, the self-deceit, to me at least, seems like a higher priority because it's much more fundamental to Satanism here. Anyway, this ended up being a pretty long episode. Let's end this episode of Satansplain here. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, hail Satan.
You have been listening to Satansplain. For more information about the show, visit the official website at Satansplain.com. And for more information on Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode is copyright 2024, Magister Bill M.